Well, it's good to see you in service tonight, and it's good to be here with a sense of God's help and presence. That was good, energetic singing and good praying, and the Lord helped us, and I thank the Lord for that. That helps to prepare our hearts for true worship. The longer we live and the better we understand people, the more we understand that our minds are incredibly important in relation to many other aspects of our lives. For example, a person can become so depressed that it causes them to have all kind of physical ailments. They can have their resistance drop until they become susceptible to diseases and discouragement can just, our mental attitudes can affect a whole bunch of other things in relation to performance. When a person becomes unsure of themselves, no matter how good they think they are at something. I was just reading today about a fellow who has had phenomenal success as a baseball player. But they said I guess he's playing in the World Series right now. I was interested in this story in relation to this, but they said that it's like he's just lost his confidence. He's become very uncertain about himself, and he's not sure he can do what needs to be done, and it's resulted in him not being able to perform as he should. And I think the devil uses different mindsets to affect us in different ways. He can make a person feel like they're missing a lot. He does that often with young people. Oh, look what you're missing. Look what you're missing. Look what everybody else is enjoying. You're here on this sideline of life. You're not out there really enjoying life. But the sad thing about that is when a person has that mindset, they often end up doing some really, really foolish things in pursuit of the fulfilling of this mindset that says, oh, I've been missing life. I know of a lady that lived by herself, and she was just depressed about that. And I can understand. She didn't have a lot of friends. She was not a terribly outgoing person herself, and so there was a sense in which she blamed the church. But on the other hand, in order for you to have friends, you got to show yourself friendly. You've got to respond. And this lady struggled to do that, and she was so lonely. And she met this guy, and he made her feel so special, and he made her feel so wonderful. But he was a punk. He was a shyster if there ever was one. This woman had worked for a number of years and saved her money and lived very carefully. He didn't care about her. He wanted what she had. And by the time he was done, she was worse off than she was before. And all of us that knew her looked back on that situation and saw that she was made very vulnerable because of this mindset. I don't have any friends. I'm missing so much in life. And this guy was the answer, the fulfillment to all of that. But he wasn't. He wasn't. That mindset made her vulnerable. I talked to a young man this past week who is very, very, very hard on his son. Every time that fella and I were together, and the boy was with us, and I loved to shoot clay pigeons, and so we went out to shoot together, and the boy came along, and I said, why don't you keep score for us? If we hit it, you put an X. If we don't hit it, you put an O. Well, that seems pretty simple. And we move from this station to this station, and here you do it on line 4, and here it's station 5, so you do line 5. Well, we skipped one because there was a whole group of people there, and we were going to have to wait a long time, so we went around them. And that threw the boy off. Well, it's thrown me off before. I've got a friend that I go shooting with who is brilliant. He's brilliant. He's owned his own business. He works in mixing medicines at a pharmacy. He's got enormous skills. He's got advanced degrees from college. And he's the scorekeeper, and he messes up. We rib him about it and razz him about it. So this boy messes up, and it's not a big deal. I mean, it's inconvenient. You got to go back and try to figure out what goes where and who did what, but the boy's never done it before, and so when everything is said and done, you don't crucify the kid. But this man just landed on the boy with both feet. And I'm thinking, oh, no. And I watched a little bit after that, and he had told the kid he didn't want any monkeying around. Well, I'm not exactly sure what monkeying around amounts to, but monkeying around could take a lot of different faces, you know. And so we had a little dead time, and the boy was crawling up on some old rusty farm equipment. And his dad was just all over him. Boy, I told you if you were going to come with us, we weren't. And I'm thinking, oh, my goodness. Because you know what can happen? When you grow up, and some of you may have had this happen to you, you grow up in a home where you can never, never, never please your dad. Very often you have a problem with feeling like you can never, never, never please God. That's a problem. That's a problem. You can't ever do enough. You can't ever be good enough. Any little deviation is catastrophic. Instead of making a correction and getting up and going on, it's I got to go back, clear back to the beginning and start all over every time. I pastored a man. That man's life, I can think of two things in his life where I'm pretty sure he deliberately did what he knew he shouldn't be doing. But that man's life was as clean as a whistle. And I said to him one time, I said, why aren't you a Christian? He and I were really good friends. I said, why aren't you a Christian? He looked at me and he said, got this sad look in his face. Before he was done talking, he was weeping, crying. And he said, the minute I start trying to serve God, I get this sense of being driven. I can never do enough. He said, I start trying to make things right. I really don't have any idea what he needed to make right. I knew the man pretty well, but he said, I feel like every time I may have said something to hurt somebody or offend somebody, I've got to go running back and tell them I'm sorry. And then when I told them, I felt like, well, maybe I made myself look better, so I've got to go back again. You know, a person can lose their mind doing that. He said, I just got to the place where I said, I can't do this. I can't live this way. That's tragic. That's tragic. So I talked to that young dad this week, and I said, listen. That boy needs you to look for things that he does right. And then if he does something wrong, it's not the end of the world. He said, well, every time I correct him, he says, oh, I forgot. I said, you know what? He probably did. He's a kid, got an attention span about that long, and he probably did forget. Don't make it World War III. Stay at the job. Don't let him just shuffle along. But whatever you do, don't make it till everything is just a catastrophe. There are some people that they know before they ever try that they're going to fail. They know before they ever try. I have some family members like that. Oh, I can't do anything. I can't talk. I can't organize. I can't. Because there's some flaw, some imperfection somewhere, they just throw up their hands and quit. You know what? If the devil can get you with those kind of things, he will just beat you to death with it. He will just beat you to death with it. I can't. Nobody wants me. Nobody loves me. I can't do anything right. I can't please God. I can't stay on track. I can't keep from failing. I'm hopeless. I'm worthless. And the devil just loved to take those clubs. And listen. He'll do it as long as it works. Did you hear me? Listen. He'll do it as long as it works. My two youngest girls were left at home as the only children. We'd had 5 children. Our house was full of laughter and arguments and bickering and fun and the whole range. I mean, we were a normal family. But we went through a stretch where my youngest daughter would just antagonize her older sister half to death. Dad, would you tell her? And I said, yeah, I'll tell her, but let me talk to you first. You make it altogether too much fun to do that. If it doesn't get you all riled up, it's not going to be near as much fun to do it. My wife and I had a hard time getting together. I thought she was beautiful, and she was, and she still is. I thought she was talented, and she certainly was. I thought she was a whole bunch of other things. But I was always wanting to look around the corner and see if there was about anybody any prettier or any more talented or any. I was a rascal. I know it. I admit it now. But she had a way to keep her thumb on me. She could get anybody she wanted. And so I'd break up with her, and she'd start dating another guy, and I could not stand it. I could not stand it. I remember she started dating this one guy, and she worked in an office. She worked in the music hall office. And I walked into her office, and I said to her, I heard you're liking him. Is that true? And she was as good at giving it back as I was giving it out. She said, well, what difference does it make to you? And I said, I can't believe that you would like him. And she stood up and put her hands like this. When she does that, son, it'd be a good idea if you'd step back 2 or 3 steps and have a good escape route. Because she said, I can't believe it would make any difference to you. I was successfully silenced right there. I didn't have another word to say. And you know, as long as something works, the devil will use it on you.
So true.
Now, that's the general idea of mindset affecting our outlook on life is what I want to talk about. But I've just kind of gotten a little further into that than I really anticipated. But across the years, I've had some family members who've really struggled with depression and things. And I found myself saying again and again, well, as long as it works, the devil will use it. As long as it works, he'll use it. But if God can help you to realize that he is the accuser of the brethren, he's a liar and the father of lies. That's what the Bible says. And if God can help you to get your head up above some of those things, and you understand that he's a loving heavenly father. If you had a bad father, well, let me tell you some good news. He's a good father.
Amen.
Your best image of a father in the world, you imagine that, and he's better than that. Because he loves you, he cares about you, wants to help you make it. He's not here to beat you down. He's not trying to get rid of anybody. He's trying to get us to heaven, folks. He's trying to get us to heaven. He's not going to give up on us. His love is not conditional. Even those that are hopelessly lost, they go past a weeping Christ to get to an eternity without Christ. So, this idea of a mindset affecting everything else in our life is very important. And I want you to look with me tonight at a passage of Scripture found in 2 Kings chapter 7, and beginning to read with the first verse there. I'll read probably down through verse 16. This is an interesting story. Israel is under siege. That is, the army has surrounded them. They've surrounded them. They won't let anybody come in. They won't let anybody go out. These people are starving to death. And so Elijah has a word from the Lord. And in verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, Then said Elisha, I said Elijah, but it's Elisha. Elisha said, Hear ye the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, Tomorrow about this time shall a measure of fine flour be sold for a shekel. A shekel was the smallest increment of money. It'd be like our penny. Sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel in the gate of Samaria. Then the Lord, on whose hand the king leaned, answered the man of God and said, Behold, if the Lord would make windows in heaven, might this thing be? And he said, Behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not eat thereof. And then it seems like the picture changes completely, but it doesn't. It's part of the story. And there were 4 leprous men at the entering in of the gate, and they said one to another, Why sit we here until we die? If we say we will enter into the city, then the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. If we sit still here, we die also. Now therefore, come, let us fall unto the host of the Syrians. That's the enemies that had surrounded them. If they save us alive, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. That's pretty good reasoning, isn't it? We're going to die anyway, so we might as well give it a shot. And they arose in the twilight to go unto the camp of the Syrians. And when they were come to the uttermost part of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no man there. For the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, even the noise of a great host. And they said one to another, Lo, the king of Israel hath hired against us the king of the Hittites and the king of the Egyptians to come upon us. Therefore they rose and fled in the twilight and left their tents and their horses and their asses, and even the camp as it was, and they fled for their life. Now the Hittites were up north of them. Here's the Mediterranean Sea. Here's Israel. The Hittites are up here in what's now Iraq and Iran, Turkey, up in there. And the Egyptians are down here. And so they're saying, Oh, the king of Israel's hired these 2 to come against us. The Syrians are from back over here. They said, Let's get out of here. And they go scurrying for home. And when these lepers came unto the uttermost part of the camp, they went into one tent and did eat and drink. And they carried thence silver and gold and raiment and went and hid it. And came again, and they entered into another tent and carried thence also and went and hid it. Then they said one to another, We do not well. This day is a day of good tidings, and we hold our peace. If we tarry till the morning light, some mischief will come upon us. Now therefore come that we may go and tell the king's household. So they came and called unto the porter of the city. And they told him, saying, We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no man there, neither voice of man. But horses tied and asses tied, and the tents as they were. And he called the porter, and they told it in the king's house within. And the king arose in the night and said unto his servants, I will show you what the Syrians have done to us. They know that we be hungry. Therefore are they gone out of the camp to hide themselves in the field, saying, When they come out of the city, we will catch them alive and get into the city. And one of the servants answered and said, Let some take, I pray thee, 5 of the horses that remain. Now, the vast majority of their animals had starved to death. Take 5 of the horses that remain, which are left in the city. Behold, they are as the multitude of Israel that are left in it. Behold, I say they are even all the multitude of the Israelites that are consumed. And let us send and see. And they took therefore 2 chariot horses, and the king sent after the hosts of the Syrians, saying, Go and see. And they went after them unto Jordan, and lo, all the way was full of garments and vessels, which the Syrians had cast away in their haste. And the messenger returned and told the king. And the people went out and spoiled the tents of the Syrians. So a measure of fine flour was sold for a shekel, and 2 measures of barley for a shekel, according to the word of the Lord. That's an amazing story, isn't it? One of those just incredible stories out of the lives of Elijah and Elisha. And when I think about it, the thing that strikes me is that here was a group of people that found themselves in hideous, horrible, terrible, awful, evil, dark, painful circumstances. And they had been in these circumstances for a long time. All of their reserves were used up. Everything they had stored up was gone. Now, on top of that, here are 4 men who are lepers. And for us to fully understand what it meant to be a leper, we have to understand that a leper had a disease that made them be called and treated as though they were unclean. Nobody wanted to touch a leper. As a matter of fact, in this day, they had to go around ringing a little bell or crying out, unclean, unclean. So if they walked into the market, they'd say, unclean, unclean, and everybody would part and give them passage. Nobody wanted to touch them. Because you see, this disease was a disease we know now of the nervous system. And what happened, your nerves began to die in your extremities. So your feet would no longer feel. And so if you stubbed your toe and tore your fingernail or your toenail out, you might get a terrible infection in that and not even feel it. You may say, well, I wish I could not feel it. But friends, you don't want to do away with pain. Pain is a gift of God. That's right. Pain tells you there's something wrong. You could die of cancer if you never had any pain. And if you have it, it makes you say, something's wrong with me. I need to go be checked. And hopefully you go soon enough that they can check you and treat you and maybe you can get better. But this disease made it so you couldn't feel. And so very often, lepers had toes missing, fingers missing, maybe other body parts missing because of this terrible, terrible disease. Not only did it make you have to be called unclean and make you lose your limbs, but this disease was contagious. And this disease didn't have any cure. You remember I talked to you about the man who was asked to dip in the Jordan River? You remember that? He had leprosy. He had to live in a separate house from the rest of his family. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with him. It was terrible. All the great things were said about him. But he was a leper. And so these men lived in horrible times. A time when the enemy surrounded them, when food supplies were gone and people were, if you read some of the stories out of this period of time, you'll read one story about a woman saying, well, let's eat my child today and we'll eat yours tomorrow. Terrible, terrible circumstances. So here were these men in terrible circumstances, and on top of that, they had the hopelessness of being lepers. And furthermore, they were outside the gate of the city. So the city is fortified, the army's out there, and the people said, "You're a leper, get out, you can't stay in here." And so they put these lepers outside and vulnerable to the enemy because of their leprosy. They had every reason in the world to have an attitude that said, "What's the use?" We call that apathy. Apathy. Do you know what apathy is? Politicians worry about apathy. They're afraid that we'll look at people and say, "Well, my vote's not going to make any difference. They're both crooks, so why vote? If you vote for this one or for that one, you're going to get a crook and a crook. You're going to get a liar and a liar." And so people say, "Oh, well, no sense in me bothering to get out and go stand in line, go cast my vote." People that sell things worry about apathy. "Oh, this is the best we can do." They don't have anything that'll do any better job than this. And so they go to great lengths to say, "You have never seen anything like this. You've tried everything else, but we have developed something that is brand new, and it will amaze you. And for a limited time, we're going to give you $2 off of every bottle you buy. If you're not completely satisfied, here's the number you can call." What are they trying to do? They're trying to shake people out of their leprosy and say, "Hey, there's a better product on the market." That's what they're trying to do. Get them out of their lethargy. Well, you know, these people, they found themselves in horrible circumstances. Their own circumstances were bad. They were socially rejected. They were outside the gates of the city. But you know, it was even worse than that. Because these people lived in a country that had forgotten God. Do you know who their previous king was? Not the one right at this point, but the one before. The king was Ahab. And that means the queen was Jezebel. The Bible says Ahab was worse than any other king that ever served in Israel. And it said his wife stirred him up to sin. Because of that, Baal worship flourished. Because of that, good people were forced out of the country. If you'll study during that time, priests and earnest-hearted people left the land of Israel and went down into the land of Judah because things were so wicked and so vile and there was so much pressure. And so it just got worse and worse and worse. In fact, the whole reason they're in this grand mess with the Syrians is because they have forgotten God and they've turned their back on him and they've prayed to Baal and they've offered their children to the god Moloch. They have lived evil, immoral, vile lives. They've forgotten God and thought they could get away with it. Sounds a little bit like today, doesn't it? Kill babies by the millions because of your careless, immoral living most of the time. Not all of the time, but most of the time. Kill them because it's not going to be convenient for you to have to take any special measures to care for a child if they are challenged in any way. Doesn't make any difference how we live. Well, that's the way it was here. Listen to what 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 30 says. It says, "And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him." In 1 Kings chapter 16 verse 33 it says, "And Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all of the kings of Israel that were before him." That is pretty serious stuff. And in 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 20, it says, "Thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of God." Yes. These people had personal reason to be apathetic. What good's it going to do? They won't let us in the city. We have no hope. There's no cure for this disease. If we get into the city, they're starving to death in there. They had no hope because their people had forgotten God, and all of this judgment had come upon them. Their nation was in a horrible, horrible condition. They were under God's wrath, and there didn't seem to be any divine help if you looked from their position. The Syrians had laid siege to Samaria until there was such a terrible famine that people were eating their own children. So these men were dying of a disease that had no cure. They were ostracized from a society that despised them and didn't care about them. They were a part of a nation that was being destroyed by famine, and they were surrounded by enemies that were bent on destroying them. That'd be a pretty discouraging set of circumstances, wouldn't it? Well, part of my job, when I went to Hope Sound, I asked the Lord, now I feel like you want me to go, but what about preaching? You called me to preach. And the Lord very specifically spoke to me and said, I want you to be a pastor to the students at Hope Sound. I preach in chapel every week. Then I'm there. I want you to be a pastor to the students. I want you to take responsibility for the faculty staff prayer meetings. And then I want you to take revivals and camp meetings. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years. And I've traveled all across the United States. I've been out in the Seattle, Washington area, Pierce County Holiness Association camp. I've been up into the New England states. I've never preached in California, but I have preached in Arizona. And many, many, many of the states in between. And one of the things that I see that really concerns me is a certain hopelessness that's affecting people.
Lord help us.
They say, well, things used to be better. I've heard some of you say that. And I'm not knocking you for saying it. I'm saying you're a part of a lot of people that are saying that. Things used to be better. Used to be more people. Used to have more glory. Used to have better altar services. Used to have more converts. Used to have more people really getting entirely sanctified. And on and on and on and on and on. And I understand that. I talk to Bible school people. And they say, oh, well, the number of young people that are candidates to go to Bible college is shrinking. Part of the reason is because kids are becoming so materialistic. It's all about what can I do to make money. And if you accept the call of God in your life, you're probably not going to get rich doing that. And unfortunately, some parents push them to do that. Well, go to Bible school for a year, but. And then I went to a camp meeting this summer where they had 2 young men for 2 morning services and 3 young ladies who'd been allowed to come and help with the cooking who came for part of the evening service. They would leave in the middle of the evening service and go get ready to open the snack shop. It just tore me up. These young ladies were more than likely not making any profession to be Christians. And here they go out to start the snack shop. And I wanted to say, what are we doing, for heaven's sake? Are we more interested in the snack shop than we are in these girls having a chance to hear the gospel and get saved? But about the time I'd get up to preach there, they'd go out the door getting ready for the snack shop. But I looked at that congregation of that camp, and it was a district camp. I looked at that and I said, they don't have any tomorrow here. They don't have any tomorrow here. And it grieved me. It grieved me. I know those people. I love those people. I wanted to go preach at their camp. But it's easy to have a spirit of apathy.
That's true.
It's easy to feel like, what's the use? We're not making any difference anyway. We're not saving our kids. We're not drawing any new ones. Now, toward the end of that week, I need to tell you that the Lord helped me. It wasn't young people that he helped me with there, but he did help me. Amen. One morning, a man about 30, I'd say between 35 and 40, came to service. And you didn't have to guess that he lived a hard life. It was written all over his face. I mean, you could take one look at him and tell that he'd been a rough character. He'd been over the road and over the hill. He came in and he looked at me and stuck out his hand and grabbed me with a big beefy hand and squeezed my hand real good. And he said, I just got saved. I said, well, man, that's wonderful. We got in service. They gave a little bit of a chance for somebody to testify. And that fella popped up. And he said, I've been arrested for DUI, for drinking and drugs. And he said, in the state of Oklahoma, if you get arrested more than once, they make you put a device on your car and you have to breathe into that device or your car won't start. So how's that for keeping drunk drivers off the road? And he said, this guy over here got the contract in this county to put those things on. And that man jumped up. He's about 65, 70 years of age. And he's crying. He said, yeah, it's God put me in contact with troubled people. I got every chance in the world to tell them about a better way to live. And that guy said, that's exactly what he did to me. They have to come have that machine checked to make sure they haven't tampered with it. So they've got to come once a week and have this guy checked, and he's a holiness fella. So this guy got to talking to him about where his life was going and what was happening to him and what he was doing to his kids and on and on. And that man prayed clear through and got saved. Amen. And I thought, oh, Lord, that's wonderful. And then by the time he sat down, another man stood up over here. And now his hand was shaking like this. I mean, it shook until his whole body shook. And he was old. He was well up close to 90 years old. Uh-oh, I shouldn't have said that, should I? I'm sorry. So he gets up and he can't hardly talk for shaking. It is very distracting. But he said, that fellow over there got saved. And he came and started talking to me about getting right with God. And he said, I can tell you what my problem is. He said, I hated a man. He said, I started a business with this guy, and he cheated me out of thousands of dollars and took that business away from me, and I hated him. And if I'd have had the courage, I'd have got me a gun and shot him. Well, I'm saying, boy, I hope you don't get one. You might shoot by accident with all this shaking going on, you know. He said, I was mad, I was angry, I was bitter. I showed it on my own family and everybody I knew. But that guy got saved. And he started telling me God could take care of that in my life. And he said, one night I got so miserable, I went over to see him, and he got me down on my knees, and we prayed, and God saved me. He said, I got my wife to load me in the car, and we drove to Dallas. And I hunted that man up. And I told him what happened. And I told him it didn't make one bit of difference what happened back there. God had changed my life, and I was on my way to heaven, and I wanted him to know that. Amen. Woo! Here's this guy shaking. But boy, the more excited he got, the more he shook. You know, he was about shaking the whole bench. But I want to tell you, that is amazing. I think he was maybe 85, 84 years old, something like that. Never been saved in his life. That doesn't happen by itself. That doesn't happen very often. And then a man who's been so filled with hatred that he says, I would have shot him if I had a gun. Oh, goodness. When you've had that all these years, but the grace of God was able to save him. That fella sat down, and another fella stood up over here. He said, I'm 71 years old. And he said, I've been an alcoholic, a problem drinker all of my life. And he said, 7 months ago, I was in the midst of another one of my drunks. And God came to me and began to speak to my heart. He said, when I was a young kid, I used to go to this church and other churches around in the area. And he said, God brought me back. And 7 months ago, Jesus saved me. And he sanctified me wholly a few days later. And he said, I've not had a drink since, and I don't have a desire for any drink since. And I'm suddenly thinking, whoa, I'd love to see this place full of youngsters, but you know what? God is still at work. And you know, that is exactly what happened here. Look with me, for example. Let me give you some examples. Their apathy made them blind to what God was doing. Let me tell you some of the things. Come right out of this same area. All of it's out of 2 Kings. In 2 Kings chapter 1, verses 1 to 15. There are two military divisions that go up to try to get the man Elisha. The king is mad at him, and he wants to drag him down. You know what happened to those military divisions? Fire came down from God and destroyed them. Now, how would you ever keep that quiet? They sent a third band up, and the man comes saying, please don't call down fire on me. Please don't call down fire. And the prophet says, okay. And he goes back down with them. God was at work. But it was easy not to see it because of all of the discouragement. 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 to 18, we have the spectacular transition from Elijah to Elisha that happened in full view of everyone who cared to notice. They go to one town, and people come up and say, did you know the Lord's going to take Elijah? I don't know how they all knew it, but they did. Everywhere they went, did you know God's going to take Elijah? And Elisha said, I know it. Be quiet. Hold your peace.
Yes, sir.
And he locked onto Elijah like a leech grabbing a hold of somebody. And he said, I'm not leaving. Yes, Elijah said, what do you want? He said, I'll tell you what I want. I want twice as much as what you have of what you have. Yes. And old Elijah's eyes get big and he says, you've asked a hard thing. Let me tell you something. If you check the record, you'll find out that Elisha did twice as many miracles as Elijah did. Isn't that incredible? And then people were watching. When that chariot came down and caught up Elijah, Elijah said, if you see me when I go. And as he took off to be with the Lord, his mantle floated down. And old Elisha goes over and picks it up. I just love this. He walks back down to the Jordan River and he wraps that thing together and he smacks the water and says, where is the Lord God of Elijah? Yes, sir. And the water parted hither and thither, it says. Yes, and it went across. And the fellows on the other side had seen it happen. They said, do you think we ought to go look for him? He might have fallen out of that chariot. He must have been pretty old and decrepit. He might have fallen down. And he said, go look if you want, but you won't find him. You go to 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 19 to 25. The waters of the city of Jericho were poisoned until people were being made sick and dying. And you know what? They said to the prophet Elisha, oh, our water is killing us. And God told him what to do. And they did it. And the well was healed. You couldn't do that in a corner. Chapter 3 of 2 Kings, verses 1 to 25. Three armies. The army of Samaria, the army of Judah, and the army of Edom go down into the wilderness. They're going to slip up on the Moabites over here who've rebelled against the king of Samaria. And they get clear down there, 3 days journey. If you go 3 days in, you got to come 3 days out, right? They're 3 days journey down in the wilderness. There's no water. Their livestock is ready to die. Their people are ready to die. And the king of Samaria is saying, oh, the Lord's brought us down here to destroy us. But Jehoshaphat, who shouldn't have been there to begin with, said, is there a prophet around? And if I'd have been there, I'd have been saying, What are you talking about, old boy? What are you doing down here? Did you ask God if you should go with him? God told you not to hang out with these guys to begin with. But that's not what God did. One of the king's servants came up and said, yeah, there's a prophet here, and his name is Elisha. And so they go to get him. And what does he do? He comes and looks at the king of Samaria, and he says, if it weren't for this fellow, I wouldn't even look at you. Woo, that's a pretty spectacular greeting, isn't it? That's the way to win friends and influence people. I wouldn't even look at you. I wouldn't pay attention. He said, why don't you go to the God of your father and the God of your mother? That would be the God of Ahab and Jezebel. And he said, oh, the Lord's brought us down here to destroy us. He said, God hasn't brought you down here to destroy us. Find me a minstrel. So they got someone to play, and he went and prayed and came back and said, you won't see wind, you won't see water, but this valley. Oh, he said, you get down there and dig in the valley, dig it full of ditches. Now, there's every reason in the world not to do that. If you're dying of thirst, you go dig in the dirt, in the wilderness, in the heat of the day. That sounds ridiculous, unless God tells you to do it. But the Lord said, make this valley full of ditches. And they did. And it didn't rain, and the wind didn't blow, but somewhere long up the trail there, the rains came to flood stage, and the water ran down and filled every ditch in that valley. Now, if it had rained there, the people from Moab wouldn't have been fooled. But since it didn't rain, they had no idea that there was water anywhere close, so they're peeking over, waiting on those guys. When they come over that hill, they're going to run into a buzzsaw. They're just waiting on them. And they peek over and they say, oh, look, there's blood everywhere. They've killed each other. Moab to the spoil. So they shuck off their armor, and they throw aside their spears and their swords, and they go down and they're going to gather all the spoil. That is all the riches and the finery and everything that those people wore, especially the leaders. And they get down there and they find out Israel is rejuvenated because God has given them water, and they beat those people half to death and chase them back into their own country. And it says they went forward smiting them. Isn't that something? God did that in chapter 3. Chapter 4, a widow. A widow was about to have her 2 sons taken away. And she went to the prophet and said, they're coming to get my boys. He said, what do you have in the house? She said, oh, I just have a couple of vessels, and that's all. There's nothing in them. He said, go get everything you can find. He said, take what little oil you've got and start pouring, and don't quit. So she had the boys running around borrowing vessels from everywhere, and pretty soon the house is full, and she keeps pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring and pouring, and every vessel they can find, finally say, Mama, we can't find any more, and the oil quit. And she had enough money to sell the oil, selling the oil, to pay the debt and live on the rest of it. Amen. Now, that was all happening right in this time. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 22 to 41, there was a kind woman who built a place for Elisha to stay. You remember that? And he was so grateful. He said, what can I ask the Lord on your behalf for? And she said, oh, I don't have any children, and my husband is old. And he said, you're going to have a child. And she said, oh, don't mess with me. Please don't mess with me. And he said, no, you're going to have a child. And she does. And the child gets up several years, and he's coming and going. And one day the kid dies. And the woman, she heads out to find the prophet, and she finds him, brings him back. And he comes and raises that boy from the dead. Stretches himself on him, puts nose to nose, mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand, and that boy comes back to life. You can't do that in secret. 2 Kings chapter 5, verses 1 to 19. The Syrian general had leprosy. I preached about that the other night. He had leprosy, and he came, and said to the king, I've come for you to heal me. And the king ripped his clothes and said, they're just trying to pick a fight. And somebody said, wait. The prophet said, send him down his way, and he'll know there's a God in Israel. And so he went down there, and the prophet didn't even come out. Made him so mad he couldn't see straight. He said, go dip in the Jordan River. He said, I wouldn't get in that filthy, muddy water for anything. I can go back. We got cleaner rivers in Syria. And he said, if you don't dip, and if you don't dip 7 times, and if you don't dip in Jordan, you're going to have leprosy. But if you do, God will heal you. And he did, and God did. That couldn't be done in secret. In 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 1-7, is the story about a man borrowing an axe. They're training new prophets, and they're building a quarters for them. And somebody borrows an axe to work on this building project, and he swings the axe, and the head flies off. And it goes in the water. You remember that? And he comes and he says, oh, master, he said, the head of the axe flew off, and I borrowed it. He said, where did it go? He said, right out in there. And he prayed, and you know what? All of a sudden, that axe head did swim, the Bible says. I don't know what an axe head looks like swimming, but it would sure have my attention. I'll promise you that. And they gave the axe. My point is this. There's one more I need to tell you about. The Lord was telling Elisha exactly where the king of Syria's army was. And the king gets his generals together and he said, okay, who's the snitch?
Yes, sir.
Who is it that's telling the king of Samaria where our army is? And one little old general fellow sticks up his hand and he said, sir, it's not us. He said, it's the God of Israel. He tells the prophet Elisha exactly where you're going.
That's right. Yes, sir.
And he said, well, you go get him. And so here they go marching off. They're going to get the whole army is coming to get this prophet who knows where they are. Well, does he think that the prophet doesn't know they're coming? And the Lord says they're coming. And he says, well, Lord, what do you want me to do? And he says, I'll strike them with blindness. You take them up in the middle of the city of Samaria, and I'll take the scale off their eyes, and suddenly they'll see themselves right smack dab in the middle of the city, and you have a big meal ready, and you feed them and send them home. Ooh, that would create no small stir. My point is very simply this. God, in the midst of dark, difficult times, God was doing some special things. And you know, friend, if we're not careful, spiritual apathy can get us down. Until we can't see the mercy of the good hand of God. Now, we're not supposed to talk politics in churches. The only place that's allowed is in black churches. That's the truth, by the way. But you're not allowed to talk in our churches. But I will tell you this. When our current president was elected, I heard all the things about him. I knew he'd been married several times and things like that. And if I'd have been able to choose, I probably would have never, ever chose him. And when he was elected, I said to people, well, he won't be much help to us about the things that are important to us. But you know what? He has been. He's been against abortion. And that's good. He's been in favor of religious freedom. And that's good. The head of the whole legal department of the government just spoke at the University of Notre Dame and talked about the importance of maintaining religious freedom. And here this rascal has put that guy on the job. He has stood by the land of Israel. Moved the capital to Jerusalem. Gave them the Golan Heights. If you ever go to Israel and you go to the Golan Heights, you'll know why they need to own the Golan Heights. Because here's this high country, and those people can sit up there with their rocket mortars and just blast those people out of that Galilee valley up there, the breadbasket of the land of Israel. Just annihilate them. And lo and behold, he does that.
That's true.
I never expected that. My point is simply, friend, there's reason to be scared. There's reason to be discouraged. But there's also reason to believe that God has his hand at work in some places we may not realize.
Amen.
We may not realize. These fellows began to think. Isn't that funny? They're sitting outside this gate. They won't let them in the city. They're vulnerable to these Syrians who would have no compunction. They're lepers as well as being Israelites. They'd have no compunction about killing them dead in a heartbeat, so they're huddled up against the gate of the city, which they aren't allowed through. And they say, you know what? If we go into the city, they're dying in there. And if we sit right here, we're going to die here. And if we go to the Syrians and they say, what are you guys doing here? We're going to kill you. All we're going to do is die. And it looks like that's our lot in life for the immediate future, no matter where we are. So why sit we here till we die? Let's go take a look. And you know what? When they did what they could, God turned on his amplifier. Did you see that? Let's go back and look at that. Look at that. That's 2 Kings chapter 7. And in verse 6 it says, well, verse 5 it says, they rose up in the twilight to go unto the camp of the Syrians. And then in verse 6 it says, for the Lord had made the host of the Syrians to hear the noise of chariots and the noise of horses, even of a great host. And their imagination started going wild. And they said, oh, they've hired the Hittites and the Egyptians. Let's go for home, boys. And off they went, shucking off clothes that kept them from running and dropping everything that they thought was precious because they did. And they just littered the way as they took off out of the siege of Samaria. You know why? God said, well, I got some lepers down there that are thinking. And I'm going to just turn up the volume here. Turn on that part about horses and chariots. Let them hear the sound of a huge force. You know, when they got there, they found out that God had provided. Now, the prophet had already said, tomorrow, at this time, there will be fine flour sold for a penny and barley sold for a penny. And the man who's was the king's right-hand man said, that can't be. If God would open the windows of heaven, that would never happen. Look at what happened to that fellow. Verse 17. The king appointed the Lord on whose hand he leaned to have the charge of the gate. So he's the king's right-hand man. And so he's the one that when the prophet says this is going to sell so cheaply, he said, if God opened the windows of heaven, that couldn't happen. He obviously didn't believe. So the king says, you go guard the gate. So he set him at the gate, and it says, and he died as the man of God had said, who spake when the king came down to him. I skipped a part there. It says, the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died. They trampled the guy to death, running headlong out there to get the plunder of the camp of the Syrians. Verse 18, and it came to pass, as the man of God had spoken to the king, saying, 2 measures of barley for a shekel, and a measure of fine flour for a shekel, shall be tomorrow about this time in the gate of Samaria. And the Lord answered the man of God and said, now behold, if the Lord, that man who was over the gate had said, if the Lord should make windows in heaven, might such a thing be? And he said, behold, thou shalt see it with thine eyes, but shall not eat thereof. And so it fell unto him, for the people trode upon him in the gate, and he died. I guess the point that I want you to get tonight is that whether you can see it or not, whether I can see it or not, God is at work. God is at work in places you don't know anything about. I was talking to your pastor, and he was telling me about Hector, Brother Hector, is that your name? He was telling me about how they needed a drywall man, and he made contact with him, and the next thing you know, they're having services here. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that amazing?
Praise the Lord.
And who knows what God will do with that?
Amen.
I don't know. I don't know what the future holds. I don't want to stick my head in the sand. But you know what? I know if we're not careful, we can get so apathetic that we don't have any joy, and we don't have any blessing, and we don't have any outpouring of the Lord's Spirit. And when somebody comes, there's nothing to make them want to come back.
Oh, God, help us.
Do you understand what I'm saying? The mental attitude can affect our performance. And so we come to church and we go through the motions.
God, help us.
And we get real discouraged. And we share our discouragement among ourselves.
Lord, help
And the first thing you know, our discouragement gets deeper and deeper and deeper. You know, I got leprosy. You know, they kicked me out. You know, the Syrians are all around the city. You know, they put us outside the gate and won't let us back in. You know, if we sit here, we're going to die. If we go in there, we're going to die. If we go to the Syrians, they're going to kill us. What good is there? But you know, friend, that's never been the answer. That's never been the answer. What the answer is to find what God is doing and to get on board with what God is doing.
Oh, God, help us.
And to ask God to help us to keep a heart that is fresh and new and full of His presence. You know what? Let me just say this to you. It can be just you and God in devotional time. And God can just come down and bless your heart half silly. I mean, God can come down your soul to greet and glory crown the mercy seat. Have you had that happen recently? God can. God can come and open His Word to you when it's just you and Him. And you know, when everything is said and done, if this church is going to be a lighthouse in this community, you're going to have God coming to church.
That's right. Oh, that's...
You're going to have God coming to church. And the way God comes to church is He comes inside you.
That's right. Oh, God, help us.
You bring Him. Not the pastor. Oh yeah, the pastor's got a personal responsibility. And he's even got a greater responsibility because he has the responsibility to preach the word. But you know, when everything is said and done, we have to bring God's presence with us.
Amen. That is so true.
We have to bring God's presence with us. I'll never forget the night. Her name was Mrs. Mullen. She was wicked. Every one of her kids except the twins, J and K, had been fathered by a different man. She was married to one man all that time and just had, her husband would go off to work and men would begin to come into the house. It's pitiful. A shame. She drank like a fish. I'd seen her get out on the front steps and get so drunk they'd have to prop her up to keep her from falling over. I've seen her 6-year-old boy, Richard, when her mother got good and drunk, go get her bottle and drink until Richard couldn't walk a straight line as a 6-year-old. They were wicked people. They lived in the basement apartment. But my mother never gave up on anybody. She remembered where she came from, and so she'd go down the alley there beside the house and go into that door under the back of that house, and she'd talk to Mrs. Mullen. And Mrs. Mullen would be dressed like a prostitute because that's basically what she was. Her face was hard. Her sins were many. But my mother would talk to her and she'd get to crying. And one night, just before Christmas, We had Wednesday night prayer meeting. You know who was at Wednesday night prayer meeting? Kenneth Stetler, Jewel Stetler, Danny Stetler, David Stetler, and Daryl Stetler. Mrs. Mullen, Jay, Kay, and Richard. There were a grand total of 9 of us there. And my dad got up and he gave a little Christmas talk about God giving himself for us and how wonderful it would be if this Christmas we'd give ourselves to him. And I looked up at Mrs. Mullen and tears were just cutting trenches down through the rouge on her face. And the next thing you know, my dad said, would anybody like to pray? Well, there's only 9 of us. And Mrs. Mullen said, I believe I would. And she came to the altar. All of us kids stayed back there and watched while my mom and my dad got one on one side and one on the other of Mrs. Mullen. And that night, she stopped being a prostitute. She stopped being a drunken, vile, cigarette-smoking, evil living woman. And God, for Jesus' sake, saved her. It shocked the whole community. People started coming to church because they saw the change in Mrs. Mullen's life. God delivered her like that from alcohol. God delivered her like that from cigarettes. God delivered her like that from immoral living. The men stopped coming. She started coming to church, and she started telling everyone everywhere she went what God had done.
Amen.
2 little families there, part of it. She had an older daughter, 2 older daughters, 3 older kids maybe. Little handful of people there, but that night, God came. You know, I've been trying to tell people everywhere I go this last summer, and in the places that I've preached, that God doesn't want us to be apathetic. Right. He wants us to get a new grip on him. Amen. And then I went to Papua New Guinea, and God gave me the cry of my heart. He gave me a new grip on God, a new hope to see what the gospel would do. And here tonight, I felt like the Lord just wanted me to say to you, don't let apathy kill you. Amen. Don't let apathy kill you. Don't be so consumed with discouragement that you give up on God. Amen. Get a new touch on him. Get a new grip on him. Amen. Get a new hold on Jesus. Get a new touch from heaven. Get some fresh help in your soul. And when you come to church, make sure God comes because you bring him. And when you sing, sing for the glory of God. And when you pray, pray like heaven is real and hell is real and people are real and they're going to be lost if Jesus doesn't save them. Pray for your pastor. Pray for everybody that has anything to do with this church. And don't let apathy kill you, because it will. Just as sure as depression has driven people to end up saying, my family would be better off if I was dead. I wouldn't be a burden anymore. And people loved him all the time. People were trying to help him. And they killed themselves. Just as some poor young people I know have been so beat down so many times and so long that they thought, I can never accomplish anything. And they just went and threw their lives away. We don't want to do that. We don't want to let a spirit of apathy destroy us. These fellas said, why sit we here till we die? If we go in there, they're dying. If we sit out here, we're going to starve to death. If we go over there, they may kill us, but they may save us alive. We've got at least a 50-50 chance. And when they started doing what they could, God did what they could and turned up the volume, ran the Syrians away, and they sold a fine flour for a penny and 2 measures of barley for a penny. Even though the man didn't believe it. I don't want to be one of those unbelieving people. Do you? I don't want to be one of those unbelieving people. A fellow was a little snarky about me here a while back. A guy came and talked to me, and he said, I was talking to somebody, and he told me who. I wish he hadn't told me who. He said, Dan Stetler's always trying to be upbeat. And I thought, well, you snarky smart of it. And then I got to thinking, hey, what's wrong with that? I'd rather be upbeat than downbeat. I'd rather be upbeat than apathetic. I'd rather believe God and trust God and do the best I can than sit back here till we die. And so, I make no apology. I make no apology. If God can help me this week to try to get your chin up a little bit and your heart a little lifted and your spirit a little encouraged, who knows what he might do? Who knows what he might do? God's at work. He's always at work. And our job is just to find where he's working and say, Lord, let me get on board right there. Let me get on board right there. Why sit we here till we die? Let's go for the camp. Who knows? God might just give us an abundance. Let's stand together. Father, you know we're just people. Our sight is so limited. Our perception is often so clouded by the dust that the devil throws in our eyes. And our hearts can get so heavy and so discouraged that we just feel like giving up. Lord, what's that going to do for us? How's that going to help the kingdom? And so we come to you tonight and say, why sit we here till we die? It's time to get up and go for the camp and see what God will do. And I just pray tonight that you touch my heart and our hearts and help us to get a new grip on God and a new sense of heaven among us. And as you help us with that, we'll certainly give you all the praise and the glory. For we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. God bless you. Thank you for listening to me tonight.